Harrier jump jet is one of the most unlikely war winners ever seen. Its ability to take off and land vertically was revolutionary, but like all revolutionary inventions, it was unstable and hazardous at first. Having finally got the art of hovering right, the Harrier would take another 20 years to prove itself. But when it did, it would write history.
I'm not allowed to say how many planes joined the raid, but I counted them all out, and I counted them all back.
The Harrier was fundamental to the Falklands. Without it, we would not have been able to set up a task force, to sail south, to do what was done.
In April 1982, it was make or break for the Harrier as the British task force began its 8,000-mile journey to retake the Falkland Islands.
There's no doubt that we couldn't have fought the Falklands campaign if we'd not had the Harrier. I mean, you're right in calling it a decisive weapon. It certainly is in the case of the Falklands. Without the Harrier, we wouldn't have attempted to go back and reinvest the Falklands.
The protection of the British fleet and 30,000 troops would be entrusted solely to the Harrier, a plane never before tested in war, and until 1982, never ever trusted by its critics.
People did not believe it would do everything we said it would, and it didn't matter how much you flew it and what you did in front of them and how much you said, they didn't believe it. Until 1982, when the airplane was actually used down in the Falklands. And then everybody was amazed. They said, golly, it does everything you said it would. And we said, yes.
All wars are one-offs, and the Harrier was the perfect weapon for that one-off war. If the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy didn't have the Harrier and the Sea Harrier, Margaret Thatcher would have just had to bite her lip and accept that we had lost the Falklands. I think it's as simple as that.
The story of the Falklands War is the story of just 20 Harrier jump jets against a 200-strong Argentinian Air Force, and the unlikely victory of an unlikely aeroplane.
If you're going to fight a war with aeroplanes, then the first thing you've got to do is to get there. And in peacetime, you don't know where there is. There may be a road, there may be a small clearing, a car park, a small ship, a large ship. The only airplane that I know that can fly from any of those places is a Harrier.
The Harrier's purpose was to dispense with the need for runways. It is the only aeroplane in the Western world to master vertical takeoff, but it was by no means the first attempt. Vertical takeoff propulsion became a worldwide aviation obsession after World War II. The British got in first with the Flying Bedstead, a hovering Rolls-Royce engine on legs. Attempts to incorporate the principle into a functioning aeroplane would take nearly a decade of stops and starts. Even those that got off the ground didn't get much further.
Well, it certainly was a bit cranky in those early days. I started working on vertical takeoff type airplanes in the mid-50s. And I was sitting next to a guy called Ralph Hooper in the Hawker Aircraft Limited project office in 1957, and Ralph Hooper did the first drawings of what eventually became the 1127 and subsequently the Harrier. We regarded it at the time more as an interesting engineering exercise, but it turned out it has been an enormously important breakthrough.
The revolutionary principle behind the British-built Harrier was simplicity itself. 4 rotating nozzles on a jet engine, which could direct thrust downwards to achieve a hover.
This is just a single engine, where the air comes out in 4 places instead of the normal 1 out the back of the engine. I mean, that's just splitting it in 4 places, that's nothing. And on the end of each of these outlets, there's a rotating nozzle. And in the cockpit that I'm sitting in, I've got 1 lever that enables me to swivel those 4 nozzles together. But that aside, it's just anybody else's jet fighter. I mean, what a wonderful achievement.
By the mid-1960s, the Harrier was established as the only high-performance vertical takeoff aeroplane in the world. But no one would buy it. Unable to match the speed of the supersonic jet fighters of the day, the Harrier was regarded as a mere novelty. Fine for doing tricks at air shows, but when it came to combat, a jack of all trades, and perhaps master of none. Able to carry bombs, but not as many as a conventional bomber. Nimble in the air, but not as fast as a conventional jet fighter.
Initially, both the Navy and the Fleet Air Arm and the Royal Air Force were, frankly, a bit hostile. It wasn't supersonic. It didn't carry a big weapon load a long distance. It was a boy's job. In fact, the phrase of the day in the end of the 50s, early 60s was, "Ha, that little thing, it couldn't carry a pack of cigarettes across a football field."
But in 1968, the US Marines broke with conventional military wisdom. They bought the Harrier. The Marines were not concerned with supersonic speed. They were far more interested in the Harrier's unique ability to operate away from runways. The American purchase also alerted NATO to the Harrier's value in a potential European war.
NATO became very conscious that if there's a Warsaw Pact march west, there are very few runways, and they would be the first targets to be attacked. And so there was this hankering after an airplane that didn't really need runways.
In 1969, finally convinced of the plane's unique abilities, the RAF formed its first Harrier squadron. However, it was still not recognized as a frontline fighter. Instead, the RAF adopted the Harrier as a ground support plane, which could operate close to enemy lines without conventional runways. But even in this limited role, the Harrier quickly won the enthusiasm of its new RAF pilots.
We were attempting to put the airplane into an entirely new context, taking it away from airfields based on concrete and operating in the field in a way that helicopters had done, but which fighters had not. So we were Boy Scouts in the field with a high-performance jet aeroplane, and that was great fun. To fly a Harrier was the most exhilarating thing that one could experience in the world.
Now, at last, the Harrier would get its chance as a fighter, thanks, ironically, to defence cuts. In the 1970s, the Royal Navy lost its big aircraft carriers, and with them, the supersonic jets of the Fleet Air Arm. Taking their place was a new generation of smaller carriers, designed for helicopters.
The Navy put up its hands in horror. How were they going to have any sort of air defence capability at sea from fighters once they went outside the range of RAF aircraft? The Navy came up with a solution of helicopter carriers, but, surprise, surprise, you could actually operate Harriers from these. And now, suddenly, you had the possibility of naval air cover. Now, they weren't happy with this, but it was all they were going to get.
This was the Harrier's big chance. Having been shunned for years in favour of bigger, faster jets, the Harrier was to be the Royal Navy's salvation. To make it suitable for operations at sea, changes were made to the Harrier's navigational system. The Navy would be the first service to use the Harrier as a fighter. A new plane, delivered into service in 1980, was called the Sea Harrier. It fell to the pilots of the Fleet Air Arm to prove what it could do.
The first squadron was 800 Squadron, and I was very, very fortunate in being chosen to head the trials unit and then the headquarters squadron and so on. It was a very, very exciting episode of generating the aeroplane from paperwork into reality.
Having made its way into full military service despite setbacks, second thoughts and cynicism, the Harrier was now ready for its ultimate test. Just 18 months later, that test arrived.
Well, for years and years we'd said what we really want is a small local war where the Harrier can show itself to advantage. Not many people killed, you know, that's cruel. And we had one. And it was called the Falklands.
British sovereign territory has been invaded by a foreign power. After several days of rising tension in our relations with Argentina, that country's armed forces attacked the Falkland Islands yesterday and established military control of the islands.
As the British task force set off, victory was far from certain. The Falkland Islands lay 8,000 miles away in the South Atlantic, far beyond the range of any friendly airfield. With no conventional aircraft carriers in the fleet, the best that Britain could do was to load 2 upgraded helicopter carriers with all the Sea Harriers the Navy had. There were just 20 of them, and they would have to meet all the needs of combat, drop bombs, do air reconnaissance, provide ground support for troops on land, and after all that, take on an Argentinian Air Force and Navy of over 200 aircraft.
On the way down, it was very clear that we were short of air defense. The Air Force couldn't provide it, and we had 20 aircraft against what we were told were over 200 Argentine aircraft who would attack the fleet. Our admiral back in Somerset told the wives while we were away on the way down that 75% of us would not return, which is a very silly thing to do. And some of my guys thought the same. And so on the way down, we were looked upon like, you know, being given the Last Supper by some of the crew on board, until they realized how confident we were.
We knew that we had about a 10-to-1 disadvantage in the air. There are 2 ways of looking at that. There's the conventional wisdom, which says you're up against very heavy odds, or there's the fighter pilot's way of looking at it, which is that it's a target-rich environment.
The fighting began on the 1st of May. Port Stanley Airfield was a crucial strategic target, a runway being used by the Argentines for delivery of supplies and the basing of offensive aircraft. The first test of war for the Sea Harriers was to bomb Port Stanley.
I came around the side of the airfield, and at that stage I saw Tracer start to come towards me, and realized that someone was actually trying to shoot down my mum's little boy. And there was a bloody great bang, and the whole aircraft started vibrating. I realized I'd been hit, and I discovered, in fact, it was a 20mm high explosive shell had gone through my tail. It made a very small, neat entry hole on the left-hand side of the fin, and then a hole the size of my head on the right-hand side. And I couldn't read any of the aircraft instruments. The vibration was so severe. But we got it back on board, and it was patched up and flying again the next morning. So that was my first taste of action. That was the famous sortie that Brian Hanrahan said in his first dispatch. He counted them all out and counted them all back.
I'm not allowed to say how many planes joined the raid, but I counted them all out, and I counted them all back.
Although the raid on Port Stanley failed to put the airfield out of action, it did enough damage to deter the Argentines from basing any of their most important aircraft there. The bulk of air missions would now have to be flown from mainland Argentina, a 400-mile flight, which would leave their aircraft with little fuel over the Falklands. Having acquitted themselves in their role as makeshift bombers, the Sea Harriers would now be tested for the first time as fighters. They were up against one of the great post-war military jets, the French-built Mirage. With twice the Harrier's speed, the Mirage was precisely the kind of supersonic specialist fighter that the Harrier was thought to be no match for. Now would come the telling contest.
In the case of the Mirage, yes, that was a fairly formidable aircraft, had twice our speed, so that was a problem.
Faster doesn't necessarily mean better in terms of fighting capability. We used to have an adage that the supersonic aeroplanes coming towards the fleet, well, that's fine, because the quicker they got there, the quicker they'd die.
For our tactics of fighting against the enemy, we used a maneuver called the hook maneuver, which quite simply was sending one aircraft in from ahead, one aircraft from behind, and putting them in a problem. They're in a sandwich, almost like the army pincer movement. It's common sense, good strategy, good tactics, and it worked. And for day one, we shot down the first 2 aircraft using this maneuver.
The first 2 aircraft destroyed in the war were Mirages. Britain's pilots had been proved right, and the Harrier had finally laid to rest the myth of its inferiority against faster jets. On the opening day of air-to-air combat, the Harrier shot down a total of 4 Argentinian jets. Not a single Harrier had been lost. But even more of a problem than the enemy was the appalling South Atlantic weather. In the early hours of the 6th of May, 2 Harriers on patrol collided in thick fog. Both pilots were killed. There were now just 18 planes left.
I mean, 18 aircraft would keep the RAF going for 2/3 of a day in the Battle of Britain. If you're talking about losses, combat attrition. Now, fortunately, the RAF was able to bring in its squadron, number 1 squadron, with its 6 Harriers, and number 1 squadron did have reinforcements during the conflict.
We flew our aeroplanes direct from the UK to Ascension Island. That's about a 9.5-hour flight. We then transferred them from Ascension Island onto Atlantic Conveyor. Once we got down to the carriers, the Royal Navy then concentrated on the air-to-air portion of the war, and we concentrated on the air-to-ground, which was our specialisation.
The RAF Harriers arrived just before British troops landed on the Falklands and were able to provide vital ground support. Liberated from ground attack duties, the Sea Harriers were able to concentrate on protecting the British fleet from air attack. On the 21st of May alone, 9 Argentine attackers were shot down by Sea Harriers. Sharkey Ward got one of them in the morning. In the afternoon, he spotted an Argentine bomber flown by Carlos Tomba.
Me grita que teníamos Harrier que nos estaban atacando. Iniciamos nuestras acciones defensivas y en un momento determinado siento que el avión tiembla.
Basically, it was a no-hope situation for the Pucara because I was firing from his 6 o'clock, that's from behind him, on 3 separate runs, hitting him each time, tearing his aircraft to pieces.
El avión vuelve a moverse en todo sentido, a vibrar, y veo que el motor izquierdo se prende fuego y me quedo sin comandos.
He stayed with it until they basically had no engines, almost no fuselage, almost no wing. Then he got out at the last minute. Very brave man.
En realidad me enteré después, cuando estuve prisionero, quién era el que me había derribado. Y a través del médico que me revisó cuando caí prisionero, me enviaba sus saludos y su reconocimiento por el combate librado y su alegría porque estuviera vivo.
He represented everything good about the Argentinian Air Force. He was very brave, professional, did everything he could to save his airplane, but was at a disadvantage.
While the courage of the Argentine pilots was never in doubt, their tactics were.
I honestly think the Argentinian pilots were very, very poorly briefed. Perhaps if they'd actually been briefed that there was a fighter threat, and really a great threat from the Harrier, then perhaps their tactics would have been different. Perhaps they would have fought the war slightly differently.
Argentina's air commanders had ordered their pilots to concentrate on bombing the British fleet. They were to avoid engaging the Harriers at all costs. Flying without fighter escort and armed with bombs rather than air-to-air missiles, they became easy prey for the Sea Harriers.
Their command actually told them don't engage the Sea Harrier. Big mistake. Their command should have told them, at all costs, kill every Sea Harrier you come across. Ditch your ground attack weapons. Use your guns or if you're carrying missiles. And we're prepared to take losses, providing you can kill one Sea Harrier for every 5 we lose. By the end of the week, the war will be over because there'll be no Sea Harriers left, or half of them left.
Cumplió un papel muy importante dentro del empleo que le dieron en el conflicto. Para nosotros era fundamental tratar de evitarlos a toda costa. Tuvimos mucha suerte. En nuestro grupo, en nuestro escuadrón, sufrimos una sola interceptación por estos aviones. Desgraciadamente fue a una escuadrilla en la cual yo integraba.
On the 5th of June, 4 Argentine Skyhawks attacked a group of British landing craft. As the first Skyhawk went in, David Morgan's Harrier intercepted.
I saw the first one drop a bomb which hit the back end of the landing craft, which made me very, very angry. Extremely angry, more angry than I've ever been in my life. And from that moment on, there was none of this bullshit about trying to shoot the aircraft down and not kill the pilot. I was going to kill that pilot.
Lanzaron 2 Sidewinder. Uno de ellos impactó de lleno en un Skyhawk, explotando en el aire.
I fired a Sidewinder missile which went straight up his jet pipe. Very large explosion, and almost nothing came out of the explosion. There was no bits larger than a dinner plate that I could see. Just a huge ball of fire, and he went into the water.
Morgan shot down 2 Skyhawks in the engagement. A third was destroyed by another Harrier. Only one of the 4 attackers escaped.
I subsequently, a couple of years ago, met the Skyhawk pilot who got away, a guy called Hector Sanchez. And I'd gone into the fight so quickly that I hadn't realized I'd overtaken him in my dive. He was actually behind me and might just have been able to get a shot at me with his gun.
Traté de disparar con mis cañones, pero se me trabaron por fallas técnicas. Así que no pude, en el momento de que ellos efectuaban el ataque a mis compañeros, no tenía con qué tirarles.
The Sea Harrier was now dominating the skies over the Falklands, and the biggest remaining concern was the terrible weather. Force 10 gales, 50-foot waves, and unrelenting rain.
The weather was very cold, as you realise it was the Southern Hemisphere's winter. It was worse than a British winter, and we were only getting 3 hours light a day, so most operations were done in the dark. It was windy, snowing, rain. You had waves coming over the deck. Even on the Hermes, with the degree of the ramp, you had waves coming over the top.
Nuestro armamento fallaba, producto de la salinidad del medio ambiente, de la gran humedad del medio ambiente y de las bajas temperaturas. No me cabe la menor duda que hubiera sido distinto si hubiéramos tenido aviones como el Harrier, que nos hubieran permitido operar en las condiciones de Malvinas.
With such a small force of Harriers, protecting the fleet meant keeping the planes in the air around the clock.
We had 8 aeroplanes on board. We were asked to do at least half the night alert, means sitting in the cockpit on deck with 1 aircraft ready to go, with 1 pilot in the crew room ready to go, fully dressed. And if you work it out mathematically, try and do that through the night with 11 pilots is what I had. It meant that you were basically awake all night, and then you were flying all day. And then you're doing the same thing the following night. We didn't really notice that it was hard at the time, but the stress was there. I mean, I'd have 5 minutes to myself in the day. I was in tears of frustration a couple of times where things weren't going right.
Where the Harriers were taken off all the time. We had at least 4 Harriers in the air at all time, probably even more. As soon as we got out the Falklands, we launched nearly every Harrier we had, and by the time they could come back onto the ship, they rolled them into another operation and they took off straight away. without any hesitation. They just went off straight onto a different role.
We flew in 801 Squadron, I think it was 695 sorties, missions. We only missed one aircraft mission through unserviceability, which in any metering or any measurement in the modern world of aeroplanes or even racing cars, the same sort of thing, it's incredible, and which is why I love it so much.
On the 14th of June, during an RAF Harrier attack on Port Stanley, Argentinian forces surrendered. The Falklands War was over. The plane, which few would have chosen to depend upon in war, had proved itself. As a fighter, the Sea Harrier had shot down 23 Argentinian aircraft without losing a single plane in air combat. A further 9 Argentinian aircraft had been destroyed in ground attacks. In its unparalleled versatility as a fighting machine, the Harrier was now established as far more than jack of all trades. It was truly the master of them.
I think a lot of people were surprised at how well the Harrier performed down in the Falklands. They were surprised because they didn't know enough about the aeroplane. The people that knew it, the people that worked it, the people that engineered it, the people that flew it, they were relieved that it did what they thought it could do in war, when war came, but they weren't surprised.
I can remember saying years before the Falklands that if I ever had to go to war, then the aircraft I wanted to go to war in would be the Harrier. And I was lucky. It happened that way, and the aircraft proved itself.
The Harrier remains in frontline service today in Britain and around the world. In the Gulf War and in Bosnia, it has maintained an international combat presence. For those involved from the beginning, the Harrier has become all they had ever hoped.
We had a lot of anxieties in the earlier days, this is the late 50s, early 60s, that the aeroplane wouldn't be officially recognized and put into squadron use. And so, yes, we were sustained, we were buoyed up by the hope that our essential belief in the rightness of the aeroplane would cause it to be adopted.